Hi there, this is Prague Talk, a podcast from Radio Prague International. My name is Ian Willoughby. My guest this time is the US historian Chad Bryant. Chad explores the relatively recent history of Prague through the prism of diverse personalities in a book just published in Czech. Entitled Prague, Belonging in the Modern City in English, the book mixes the stories of socialists, dissidents, Jews, Germans and Vietnamese, with absolutely fascinating facts about the development of the metropolis from the late days of the Habsburg Empire to the present day. And I spoke to Chad Bryant when he was in town for the launch of the Czech translation for this edition of Prague Talk. So Chad, you're a professor of history at the University of North Carolina in Chapel Hill. You're an expert in the history of this region, specifically of the Czech lands. What led you to Czech history and all things Czech?
I guess the short answer is that I worked as an English teacher in Žďár nad Sázavou in 1993, and it was at the moment I really kind of fell in love with the country. And I became a newspaper reporter after that for a little bit, and then decided that a great way of sort of combining writing and teaching and returning here every year was to go to grad school and become a Czech historian. And
tell us about your experience of living here. How long did you stay here at that time?
So I lived here from 1993 to 1994 during the school year. And I worked for, it was a new private gymnasium for tourism. And also there was like a sort of another school, community, what we call community college, like attached to that. And also I worked for Žďár, the big steel factory there for a little bit. So it was great. It was a good time. It was an interesting time to be here in 1993.
You're here now for the Czech launch of your 2021 book, Prague, Belonging in the Modern City. It looks at different periods in the modern history of Prague. And those periods are tied in each case to one individual. Mm-hmm. I think it's a fantastic book, but I'm very curious, how did you hit on that structure?
I wandered my way toward it. So I was approached by my editor at Harvard, Kathleen McDermott, to write a book about Prague, because we both felt that there was a need for it in English. And I began writing sort of a typical history of the city and its leaders and its great musicians and artists. And then I realized that I kept replicating the expected sort of narrative that focused on the canon of Czech nationalism and Czech history. So I then decided I would disrupt that by finding people who were sort of marginalized characters in the city's history and focus on them and try to recreate the city at different moments in time from their point of view.
Well, the first section is called German City, and the person you focus on is Karel Vladislav Zapp with one P, who previously was known as Karl Zapp with two Ps. He Czechified his name and himself. Who was Zapp, and why did he change his identity like that?
Yeah, well, so Zapp came from sort of a lower middle class, German-speaking family, and he eventually found his way into university here in Prague. And I think one of the reasons, we don't really know, he didn't keep a diary or memoir, but one of the reasons it seems that he began speaking Czech and changed his name was that he fell in with a group of of Czech patriots at that time, the same time as Karl Heinrich Mácha and others, and became sort of enamored with the Czech national movement and the Czech language, and became became a patriot of a sort, and also fell in with this group. And I think that was part of the story too. It was almost happenstance that he became friends with this community, and this community gave him this sense of belonging in the city as a Czech, and then he began to imagine the city as Czech as a result.
And would that have been a common thing for somebody who was from a German background to Czechify themselves? For example, I guess the best known case of this would be Miroslav Trš, the co-founder of Sokol, who was previously called Friedrich Emanuel Trš, spelled in the German way. Was that common?
It happened. It wasn't extraordinarily common. My colleague Gary Cohen wrote a great book a long time ago about a lot of Czech-speaking rural working-class folk from the countryside German-speaking people from the countryside, especially who came to Prague later in the century, eventually sort of became Czechified. They adopted Czech as their first language and so forth. And then there are cases here and there. The vast majority of the awakeners, however, at least at this time period, most of them were Czech-speaking sons and daughters of rural, peasants.
So there's also a class aspect. These were not the elite.
No, that's the really important thing about that chapter, I think, is that at that time the official language of the Habsburg bureaucracy was German. The gymnasia, the high schools that led to college, were all in German. The administration was in German. And the largest sort of factories and banks and the middle classes, almost all spoke German, because this was also seen as the language of education. And so the lower middle classes absorbed, sort of embraced Czech as almost as not as a protest, but as a means of distinction from that, and eventually sort of sought their way into the middle classes while still distinguishing themselves from the upper middle class German speakers.
And Zapp promoted strolling around Prague.
Yeah, he did. So that was like one of the ways in which this group of people, Zapp and his friends and others, sort of they were mimicking the practices of the upper middle class German speakers, who were in turn mimicking the practices of the aristocrats, of European aristocrats of their time. It was a means of socialization and creating community, and also, like as I write, also creating a sense of place by walking the city. They actually walked the walls of the city, which were open at that time.
That's also interesting. In the book, you talk about the fact that the city walls, which also had like toll gates or whatever, were done away with towards the end of the 19th century.
Yeah, it was very controversial because many people did enjoy walking along the walls. But you can see the footprint of those walls.
Petřín, right?
Yeah, Petřín, the highway, the Vilsonova, that goes along just below here, the studios here. That was the wall, and also like where Hlavní nádraží is right now. Yeah, and it was very controversial because people enjoyed, walking along the walls. But there were a lot of businesses on both sides of the walls that wanted to do away with them, and they didn't serve any function anymore. They used to be a customs barrier, primarily in the 19th century, and that was also done away with.
Well, the next section of the book you call Czech City. When and how did the city switch from being German, as you put it, to Czech in terms of the running of the city?
So over the course of the 19th century, especially after 1848, there's a mass migration of Czech speakers from the countryside to the city to work in the factories and so forth. But there's also like a booming of the Czech middle class, thanks in part to education laws, which allowed for the expansion of elementary school education, but also the creation of Czech language gymnasia, and eventually in 1881 a Czech university here in Prague. And so by the late 19th century, this Czech middle class had grown in such size that they were able to sort of win the votes and eventually take over city council. And they also began to take over the city spatially. As you walk anywhere here and see these beautiful late 19th century buildings on Václavské náměstí and Národní and so forth, these were sort of monuments to Czech success. Obecný dům was the culmination of that moment, of showing that we not only have wealth and political power, but we have culture as well.
And they took down the German street names.
And they did take down it used to be it was first German, then bilingual, and eventually took down the German street names as well, which for German speakers, you can imagine how traumatic that must have been.
In the section Czech City, you focus on Egon Erwin Kisch, who I must say was the only protagonist I had heard of, who was a German language journalist. Why did you select him to be representative of that period?
First of all, because I love his writing. So this was the early part of his career. He eventually went on to become a travel writer. He supported the Communist Party. And died in 1948. But this was his first years when he really made his name. And I chose him, one, because he captures this moment in which German-speaking Jews especially became increasingly marginalized in this city that was increasingly dominated by the Czech middle classes especially. And also I liked his writings. He wrote a column called Prager Streifzüge, or Prague Forays, as I translate it. And he made a point of going into down-and-out places and attempted in his own sort of bourgeois way to have a sympathetic view of the down-and-out. I don't think he would have used the word proletariat at that time.
But some people accused him of slumming it a little bit, no?
Yeah, that's right. He was, and it was very clever, right? He would go in, he would often get dressed. He would sometimes even dress, as a pauper or whatever, and go slumming and then come back and write these beautiful stories for his upper middle-class German audience. So it's a complicated figure, and I think he, in his defense, his writings were republished by the Czech Social Democratic Party, so I think they saw something useful there. But
Around this time also, there was the slum clearance of the Josefov district, the Jewish quarter as it's known. I was surprised, though, that by the time that they did away with that quarter, that only around 1/4 of the population were still Jewish.
Yeah, that's right. Because up until the early 19th century, Jews within Josefov were not allowed to leave the so-called ghetto, and not allowed to buy property outside of that. But after 1848, or even before that, many began to do so and moved out as quickly as they could. I take that back. Not as quickly as they could, but they had the opportunity to do so. And the wealthier ones especially could afford to do so. And so the sort of left to this space for land which was not very sort of desirable, right by the river, really, really bad infrastructure and so forth.
And was the razing of hundreds of buildings necessary, or was it a kind of loss for Prague, do you think?
It's a debate that sort of still takes place today. I mean, the biggest loss were for the people who lived there. They were simply expelled from their homes and became homeless overnight. One of the arguments at the time was that this was a sanitation effort, but it was also intended primarily to beautify Prague. This was seen as a sore spot, for Czech national pride in the city, and there was a lot of xenophobic and racist sort of like stereotypes that were sort of imagined onto that space, which Kitsch has to. He sort of wrote after this all, but the remnants of the anti-Semitism were very much like alive in Prague at that time.
In the Revolution City part of the book, you focus on the foundation and early decades of the Czechoslovak Communist Party through a member called Wojciech Berger. But there were a few facts also in that part of the book that really jumped out at me. One was that Masaryk had his own intelligence service, which would seem to me to kind of go against his benevolent image. Why did he have his own intelligence service?
It was mostly to keep an eye on the political parties and his rivals and so forth. I think even more so, it was the censorship apparatus that he sort of oversaw. I mean, I think it's also important to kind of like understand, to like sort of appreciate like how fragile the Republic must have felt in 1918. There was a communist government, obviously in Bolshevik Russia and Hungary. There was an uprising in Munich, and there were also German-speaking uprisings in places like Kazan. And so this was a sort of a heavy hand to protect what he saw as an important project.
And also the Czechoslovak Communist Party got 1 million votes in one of the elections in the interwar period.
That's right. Yeah, 1/5 of the vote in 1925, I believe.
Also, I thought the Spartakiads were created after 1948, when the communists basically took the Sokol sleds and rebranded them. But you say that the two kind of ran in parallel between the wars.
Yeah. So the original Sokol with Tirsch was the 19th century, of course, as you know, and they were inspired by German equivalents. And so, it was in part sort of Bolshevik, Soviet inspired, but it was also sort of grew out of these local roots because the Social Democrats had also had their own gymnastics organizations before the war, and the Spartakiadia. And as I write in the book, this was one of the many ways in which like radical leftists within the Social Democrats broke away from the Social Democratic Party. They created their own gymnastics organizations, and Berger was crucial to that. He was in the gymnastics organization here in Viton, right below the Vyšehrad.
And in 1921, when the Spartakiad took place at Magnini, it was a huge event. Yeah,
absolutely. And it was a wonderful sort of documentary, if you can find on YouTube, of that moment of marching in, and the enormity of the Spartakiad and sort of the coordination of all is really best seen like live. You see all these different people moving in unison. That's really the idea, is that you are part of this larger sort of movement, this larger community, and you get meaning through that effort. And it was very powerful. And he wrote about this in his diary, all like how emotional this moment was. And he encouraged his kids to do it as well and so forth.
Are you one of those people who regard the First Republic as not having been a success?
I think that's a hard question to answer. what's the measure of success in some ways. I mean, in some ways, they were a product of the late 19th century and in many ways, political practices and middle class political practices of the time. And they were facing a lot of headwinds. I mean, this was, as the cliche goes, the last liberal democracy in Central and Eastern Europe. But that said, I think there was also a lot of sort of blindness to sort of Slovak nationalism, to working class concerns. There was a lot of paternalism that came with it.
In the fourth section, Communist City, the main character is Hanna Frejková, whose father, Ludwig Frejka, was a communist economist who worked for Gottwald. Previously, he was known by his German name as Ludwig Freund. Mm-hmm. He was executed after the notorious Slansky trial. What was the appeal of Hanna Frejková as a character for you? I know you also met her, and as far as I know, she's still alive.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. In fact, I'm having a kolach with her on Friday. So, she's wonderful. I was actually referred to her by my friend and colleague Katarzyna Czapkova, who I'm co-writing a book with her and Diana Dumitru right now about the Slansky trial, which ended in Ludwig Frejka's death. And she had, suggested that I read the memoir. One, because, Hanna's background is, again, this wonderful mix of German, Czech, and Jewish backgrounds. And then also the memoir really kind of captures her life after her father's execution and her effort to sort of find her way back into society that had, literally expelled her and her mother from the city after his death.
And yet, when Gottwald died, Hanna and her mother, Elżbieta, formerly Elizabeth, they cried.
Yes, and people often talk about that moment. It's kind of hard to recreate, and I wouldn't even try to get in the minds of people who lived that. Part of it is sort of a group, I would say, a collective sort of, obligation, but also feeling. But I don't know. It was an interesting moment.
The most famous or notorious show trials were, of course, the Slansky trial and the trial of Milada Horáková. But you say in early 1951, there were nearly 500 local show trials. Would they have been on the same kind of model with fabricated testimonies, all that kind of stuff that we know from the classic show trials? Yeah.
They weren't, and they weren't. I mean, the Slansky trial was recorded, and actually it was videoed as well. And those, these other smaller show trials were not, and most of them were kind of behind closed doors. But they were sort of, publicized in local papers and so forth. It's sort of a lot of it depends on how you define show trial. Like the Slansky trial is the classic kind of show trial in which the defendants are reading out a script, and that this was made into a propaganda effort to explain away deficiencies of some sort and also undo rivals within the party.
But also, didn't Ludwig Frejka write some letter to Gottwald basically apologizing for whatever he had done or hadn't done?
It's maybe less an apology than sort of, it was a complicated letter. I think like a lot of the people who confessed, I mean, obviously they'd undergone, months of torture and they knew that their families were under threat. But there was also this sense that among some of them that they were willing to sacrifice themselves to the party. And in that letter, I think he's also mostly saying in coded words, I didn't do anything wrong. I did exactly what you asked me to do, and I did this. I've always been a committed member, committed to this cause. And so I kind of read it as sort of that it's almost a sense of, he's writing with a sense of betrayal. Maybe no one else know, but at least I hope that that I wasn't part of this fictitious conspiracy. And he was Jewish, and I think he didn't say that, but it was pretty clear. He understood what was going on.
And Hanna Frejková herself, she has had a very colourful life. But still, I think in some ways, maybe her story is not so atypical of somebody who somehow found a way to navigate through the communist years and have some kind of okay life.
Yeah, in some way. So she became an actress, and very well-regarded actress here in Prague in the 1970s and 80s, especially. And like a lot of people, she kind of found her space within normalized Czechoslovakia. I mean, other people found their spaces in chaty or in their apartments or other sort of, other places where they could meet people and enjoy a sense of community different than sort of the official spaces of going to parades or or even schools, which required certain curricula and so forth.
You say also that about 20,000 Czechoslovak Jews were the victims of something called Operation Spider early in the normalization period. What exactly was that?
That was mostly an effort to sort of, for lack of a better word, sort of terrorize many people of Jewish background here in the 1970s, and it grew out of sort of this anti-Semitic sort of moment which was in some ways more intense than ever it had been under Stalinism or in the immediate years after Stalinism. And so it was mostly sort of run by the secret police, and it was this intensive sort of surveillance of anybody who they considered to be Jewish.
The final section of the book, your lead character is a Vietnamese blogger called Duong Nguyen, and you write quite a bit about the Vietnamese minority here. Mm-hmm. That part is called Global City. Can we really consider Prague to be a global city?
Yeah, well, my argument there in some ways it's always been like a city of migration. So whether it was, Czech peasants in the 19th century, or people being, or Germans being expelled after the war, or Greek sort of civil war fighters coming here afterwards, and so forth. And even during the communist period, there were various international agreements with places like Vietnam and Angola, which, brought people from around the world to Prague. My argument there is in some ways it's always been like connected to the larger world. But in this case, like especially after the fall of communism, the world came to Prague in ways like through capitalism, but also through migration, specifically through the Vietnamese community, but also the Ukrainian community. Many Slovaks moved here, Yugoslavs, in the 1990s and so forth.
Well, I would say that some foreigners, especially from the States, UK, they tend to regard Czech society as quite vanilla. Mm-hmm. But for me, it is very international. It's just a different kind of international.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And I think that's really, it's an important sort of, I think it's very important to kind of rethink that whole thing. I mean, I'm always very cautious. I'm not Czech. I don't live here. I'm not a citizen. I don't vote. But I think it is important. And I think this is sort of a global sort of challenge that we'll have, is how to imagine sort of a sense of community and nation that isn't based on race. Zhang her writing is fantastic. Her Czech is beautiful. And in my mind, she's more Czech than many people I know, because she loves this place and she loves this language. And that's the core of what Czechness is really, in my mind, like about language and this culture and this history. And it doesn't mean that you have white skin to become part of that.
Many thanks indeed to Chad Bryant for speaking to me about his marvellous book, and I look forward to reading that other book on the show trials. Prague Talk is a podcast from Radio Prague International, and if you're new to the pod and enjoyed my conversation with Chad, why not check out some of the many earlier episodes in the series. But for now, that's all from me, Ian Willoughby. Thank you so much indeed for listening to Prague Talk, and talk to you again very, very soon.